Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Jules Keith Lee with the Center for Teaching and Learning, Instructional Design and Academic Technologist, and I am joined today by Kate Dixon, the Copyright and Licensing Librarian from Atkins Library here at UNC Charlotte. She's going to talk to us today about copyright and remote learning. So let me pass the presenter ball to Kate. Welcome, Kate. Thank you for doing this session for us today.
Thank you so much, Jules, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So yeah, like Jules said, we're going to talk today about copyright as it applies to remote teaching. I know that this past spring, a lot of us got a quick crash course on moving our classes online very quickly. And I'm sure all of you found that there were a lot of pedagogical and technical issues that came up that made that shift from in-person to online teaching challenging. And I know from talking to and hearing from a lot of faculty that you've been encountering some copyright questions too during that switch, which makes a lot of sense. So today we are going to talk about some of those copyright issues that come up when we're teaching online, and hopefully this will clarify some of them. We will see that some of the legal issues are the same in both contexts, in-person and online teaching, and some are a little bit different. So I'll offer some guidance on thinking through the copyright issues that are different online. Okay, so let's get started with a brief overview of copyright. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before, but just to put this all in context. So copyright law comes from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. So that is where copyright comes from in our country. And I like to note right here at the beginning that copyright has always been about that social good and that promotion of knowledge and ideas. So this aligns really well with our goals as a research university. A couple more details about copyright. So copyright protects original works of authorship. So for a work to be original, it has to meet two criteria. The first is independent creation, so it can't be copied from another work. And the second is that it must exhibit at least a small amount of creativity. So that's originality. And then the other main requirement is that the work be fixed in a tangible medium. So that medium could be paper, it could be canvas, it could be the memory card on your camera or your phone, the hard drive on your computer, or even in the cloud. So as long as it's fixed in that tangible medium. So generally copyright lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years, which is quite a long time, and that's gotten longer over the years since that constitutional provision that we talked about earlier. Copyright holders have a number of exclusive rights, and that includes the right to reproduce and distribute and publicly display their works, and also to create derivative works. So all that includes the right to, say, perform a play, sell copies of the book, or authorize someone to make a translation. So that's a very brief background on copyright, and now we're going to go into talking about fair use, which is an exception to those exclusive rights that copyright holders have. And it's one of the principles that allows us to put copyrighted materials online when we're teaching remotely. So the fair use provision in the Copyright Act allows for the copying and distribution of limited portions of copyrighted materials to support teaching and education and research. So if you're wanting to copy materials to share with your students online, either by downloading and then uploading files to Canvas or scanning physical documents, fair use is going to be a really important thing for you to consider. So that fair use provision in the Copyright Act is trying to balance the rights of copyright holders with other people's needs to use copyrighted works in certain circumstances, especially the educational context. So in order to determine whether your proposed use of copyrighted material is fair, there are 4 factors that you're going to want to weigh. And these are very case-specific, and they're also not meant to be exhaustive. Also, keep in mind that not all of these factors have to favor fair use in order for your use to be fair. So think of it more like a risk analysis, and each situation and each proposed use you want to make of copyrighted materials is going to be a little bit different. So this is an overview of those 4 factors. The first is the purpose and the character of your use. The second is the nature of the original copyrighted work. Third is the amount and substantiality of the portion you're using in relation to the whole. And the fourth is the effect of your use on the market for the original. So now we're going to go into each of those four factors in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the first factor is the purpose and character of your use. So this includes whether your use is commercial or nonprofit educational. So there are some types of uses that are more likely to be fair under this first factor. Educational and nonprofit uses such as teaching and research and scholarship are favored. Also criticism and commentary, parody, and reporting. So other types of uses that are favored under this first factor are what we call transformative uses. So the Supreme Court has said that the question there is whether the new work merely supersedes the objects of the original, or does it add something new with a further purpose or a different character, a different meaning, or a different message. So the Second Circuit Court has looked at, you're probably familiar with the HathiTrust and Google Books repositories. So the Second Circuit looked at those and found that those databases were transformative because the purpose of the databases was new. So they were preserving the books and indexing them. In the Google Books case, they were providing small snippets of text around the search terms. They weren't providing the entire text. And so that is a very different purpose from the purpose behind the writing of the original books. Another lower court found that a search engine's use of thumbnails of copyrighted images was okay and was transformative because it was giving access to information versus the artistic expression purpose of the originals. Another similar case involved a book about the Grateful Dead, which used little thumbnails of concert posters in a timeline about the band. So there the purpose of the use was transformative because it was giving a history of the band rather than the purpose of the original posters, which was to advertise the concerts. So those are just a few examples of how courts have looked at that transformative piece of the first factor. So this first factor is really important in the fair use analysis, and the great thing for us is that educational uses and nonprofit uses like the ones we make in teaching and research at UNC Charlotte are very much favored. Another thing just to mention that's specific to what's going on right now is that there are some copyright experts who have said that the exigent circumstances caused by the COVID-19 crisis add a strong rationale to support the fair use argument for this first factor, because the idea is that scanning and putting these materials online to facilitate online instruction also helps the public health, which should be a favored use under this first factor. And then I've linked, I think the slides are going to go out later, and I've linked a statement to that effect here in this slide. Okay, so the second factor looks at the nature of the original copyrighted work. So under this factor, the use of factual content, such as nonfiction and news, is more likely to be a fair use than the use of creative works. And then also the use of published works, works that have previously been published, is more likely to be considered a fair use than the use of unpublished works. So this factor is rarely decisive, but it's still something to consider. Okay, the third factor is the amount and substantiality of the portion that you're using in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. So you might hear people referring to a 10% or one chapter rule, which is kind of a rule of thumb that people use, but that's not actually a legal rule. So the amount you're using needs to be appropriate for the specific use under the specific circumstances in each case. So generally speaking, using a small amount of the original that's appropriate for a favored use under the first factor is more likely to be considered a fair use. So I always tell people, look at whether you're using no more than necessary to achieve your pedagogical purpose. So this factor is both quantitative and qualitative. So it looks at both the actual amount you're using as a fraction of the whole, but then also at how substantial it is. So if you take just a small part, but it's what's called the heart of the work, or what could be considered the heart of the work, you still might not be engaging in fair use. On the other hand, the Second Circuit Court has pointed out that the third factor does not necessarily weigh against using an entire work if use of the entire work is necessary to achieve that first factor purpose. So there's no categorical rule against that if the other factors are leaning towards fair use, but of course it's less likely. So that's the third factor. And then the final factor, the fourth factor, is the effect of your use on the market or value for the original copyrighted work. So this, along with the first factor, is one of the really important factors to consider. So if there's no significant effect on the market or the potential market for the original, then this factor is likely to support fair use. But on the other hand, if your use is just replacing a sale of the original copyrighted work, it's less likely to be considered a fair use. It is probably okay for there to be some small amount of market harm here. So the court in the Google Books case, for example, said that the effect on the market needs to be meaningful or significant, and the possibility of some loss of sales isn't necessarily enough to find against fair use. So the important question to ask here under this fourth factor is whether you're copying the original just to avoid buying a copy in the marketplace. So that's all of the 4 fair use factors. And then just to kind of sum up, here are some best practices for fair use. So if you're planning to make digital copies available to your students on your class Canvas site and you're wanting to rely on fair use, it's important that you start with a legally obtained copy and then follow these recommended practices. So use content that has a clear connection to your course objectives, so that it's really connected under that first factor to your educational purpose. Then use only as much of that copyright protected content as is necessary for your use. And then if you can, transform that content into a resource that's just for your class. So we talked about transformative use under that first factor. So if you can limit the portions of each different work you're using, combining portions of different works to create a new expression of that course content, maybe add annotations and study questions, analysis. You can think of it as creating unique juxtapositions of different materials. So if that's possible, you'd be turning the content into a new pedagogical tool that's kind of transformative under that first factor. You also want to include copyright notices and attribution. So link to or include information about copyright and give students information about their rights and responsibilities related to that content. And also just be cautious with materials that were specifically designed for use in a course. So textbooks and workbooks and that kind of thing. So that is a brief overview of fair use, and fair use can justify a lot of the uses we make of copyrighted materials in the online educational setting. So now I want to look in a little more detail at some of the specific types of materials you might want to put online as you're teaching remotely, and some of the options that might be available to you besides just relying on fair use. So let's look at course readings first. So the first thing I want to point out is that it's always easiest and safest from a copyright perspective to provide links instead of the actual materials being in Canvas. So you can link to content directly from Atkins Library or open access repositories, other publicly available content. So that can often be the easiest and the least legally risky method for providing access to class materials. And if you need assistance with any of our library subscription content, your subject librarian can be a big help there. And much of our subscription content that's available through the library's catalog will have permalink options. So that makes it very easy for people to access those off campus. Another thing to point out is that in light of the pandemic that's happening, some vendors and publishers have been making some or all of their content freely available. And we'll have to see if that continues going forward into the fall semester. But this LibGuide that I've linked here is provided by the library, and it will have updates on which publishers and vendors are continuing to make materials available online for free. Another really great thing that's available to you are open access resources. So open access, or OA, refers to peer-reviewed scholarly research and literature that's free, online, and openly licensed for sharing. So OA repositories preserve and provide access to this material. It can come in the form of articles, preprints, reprints. It can also be data, theses and dissertations, other media. And you might also consider adding your own articles to UNC Charlotte's institutional repository, which is called Niner Commons. So that's a new resource we have available. Any material that you find online that has a Creative Commons license can also be posted just as it is in Canvas, although attribution to the author is probably required. So be sure to read the license carefully, but Creative Commons licensed materials can be a really great resource because you can use them without permission and without worrying about copyright. So another great resource is Google Scholar, which allows you to search scholarly articles that are available online in general. It includes works that have a variety of different license terms, but this is a great way to find specific articles that you might want to provide to students and find out if they're available for free in their author's own institutional repository. Another great resource is the Directory of Open Access Books. So this is a searchable database of monographs that have been made openly accessible by academic publishers. And then the Directory of Open Access Journals is the same idea, but for journals. So these are peer-reviewed and vetted journals with really great content that just happens to also be open access. And then the Open Access Directory, which I've also linked here, is a list of OA disciplinary repositories. So there are a lot of different repositories there in the fields, all types of different fields: physics, math, computer science, biology, all sorts of different repositories there where you can find open access articles. And then for course readings, also fair use is always an option for in-copyright material. So you would go back through those 4 fair use factors that we looked at before. Okay, so next we'll look at slide images. So generally speaking, if it was legal to show slide images in your face-to-face classroom, it's most likely legal to show them to students via a live video conference or in recorded videos. So as long as your course is being shared through authorized course websites and limited to those enrolled students on Canvas or other restricted teaching platforms like that, the legal issues are very similar. And many instructors also will post a copy of their slides, the file, for students to access after those in-person course meetings anyway. And that employs the same rationale as fair use does. Okay, so in-lecture use of audio or video. This is a place where we get a lot of questions, and it can be a little bit tricky. But just to give you sort of the context, playing audio or video off of physical media during an in-person class session is completely legal under a provision of copyright law called the classroom use exemption. So that is about face-to-face teaching, but that exemption doesn't cover playing the same media online. There's some slightly different legal background there when you're talking about online teaching. So we can still share audio and video online if we meet the requirements of what's called the TEACH Act. So the TEACH Act in the Copyright Act provides a special exemption for distance learning activities. So I'll give you just a brief overview of the TEACH Act's requirements. So under the TEACH Act, you are allowed to put online in Canvas as long as access is limited to authenticated students in the class. You can put an entire performance of a non-dramatic literary or musical work, or reasonable and limited portions of a dramatic literary, musical, or audio visual work, or other works such as images in an amount that's comparable to what would be displayed in a live classroom setting. So what is a non-dramatic literary or musical work? This would cover things like reading a poem or listening to music, as long as that's non-dramatized. So not opera or musicals or music videos. So that part where you can post the entire original work is pretty limited, but in those cases you can post the entire thing. And then for dramatic works, which are movies or readings from fiction, for example, you can use short clips as long as you're really subjecting them to discussion, using only as much as you'd use in a face-to-face setting. So other requirements of the TEACH Act. The material should, like I was saying earlier, the material should only be available to students who are registered in the class, so that they need to authenticate to get to them. And so not on an individual faculty member's individual web page. And it's also important to attach a notice indicating that the materials are copyrighted. So under the TEACH Act, you're not allowed to use works that are specifically marketed as part of online instructional activities. So those would be commercially available digital education materials that are created for that purpose. And that makes sense since those materials were designed to be used and paid for in the online context. You also should not use unlawful copies of copyrighted works. So if you know or have reason to know that they're not lawfully made copies, steer clear of those. And it also, the TEACH Act does not cover textbooks and course packs and electronic reserves and those types of materials that are purchased individually by students to be independently reviewed outside the classroom. So just to sort of sum up, the TEACH Act is limited to the kinds of materials an instructor would actually incorporate as an integral part of a class time lecture. It covers works that the instructor would show or play during that face-to-face class time, like movie clips or music clips, images of artworks in an art history class, or a poetry reading, that kind of thing. It does not cover materials that you may want students to read or listen to or watch on their own time outside of class. For those types of materials, you would be going back and relying on fair use, which we discussed earlier, or getting permission. So even if you can't meet all of the TEACH requirements, you still might be able to rely on fair use, but you need to go through that fair use analysis and weigh all 4 of those fair use factors. Actually, I had one more thing to say about that. So for video to include, you can also look at publicly available content. So YouTube and Vimeo and other media content providers will often let you embed into your course website or teaching materials, or you can always provide a link like we talked about earlier. So there is a lot of content available online, but not all of it is lawfully provided. So just be alert to that. So some questions to ask when you're linking to content online. Is it posted by the author, the creator, or the publisher? Is it provided by an authentic educational research, governmental or journalistic entity? And is it complete, and is it legible and accessible? So linking to news websites and existing online videos, other publicly available resources, like we've talked about, is normally not a copyright issue. But if that content looks like it's obviously pirated or in violation of copyright, it's best to avoid even linking to it. So if it's, for example, just like a shaky handheld video recording of an entire movie, that's probably not the best thing to link to. And then a final thing to note with regard to video is that commercial streaming services are also always an option. So getting students to purchase individual accounts with Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or Disney Plus, that's often the easiest and the least risky way to get video to your students. And then, so one final thing I wanted to touch on is getting permission. So if the thing that you want to use in your online class isn't openly available and you've gone through that fair use analysis and you don't feel like you're safely in fair use territory, it does not necessarily mean you're out of luck, because you can always ask for permission from the copyright holder. So permission doesn't have to take any particular form. It can even be given orally or over the phone, though I would encourage you to try to get it in writing just to have it for your own records. So some things to include when you contact that copyright holder in your email or permission letter. Be sure to identify yourself and your institution, mentioning that it's a nonprofit and educational purpose that you want to make of that copyrighted material. Identify the portions of the work you specifically want to use. Describe that proposed use, including any changes you want to make, and any restrictions you'll place on the audience. So is it only going to be available in Canvas? Is it only going to be available on campus or to that one class? Also request contact information for other possible right holders if you're not sure you have the right one, and then offer to provide attribution and ask for the preferred format of attribution. So that is pretty much all I have for this, and I would love to hear any questions you might have.
Okay, Kate, I have been monitoring the questions. Someone wanted to know if we were going to send the slides out, and yes, I will absolutely follow this class up with the slide deck and a link to our YouTube channel where we should have this video up by the end of the week. So if you need to view it again, you can. We have another question here about posting a PDF of an article from JSTOR acquired through our password access directly on Canvas. Is that okay? Or should we send students to JSTOR via a link that requires them to use their own password?
That is an excellent question, and I would say that if you can, it would be better to provide the link to that resource in our catalog. And that is just because it sort of obviates the need to go through that fair use analysis, and it allows the student to authenticate themselves, which also helps with our library statistics so we know how much certain resources are being used. So yeah, if at all possible, working with your subject librarian to get a permalink to that article through JSTOR would be the best thing to do.
Okay, our next question is there anyone else on campus we should inform when requesting copyright permission?
So if you are requesting copyright permission from someone outside the university, I guess, no, you actually don't need to tell anyone. If you need help with tracking down a copyright holder or, you know, putting together your permission request, you can certainly get in touch with me and I can help, but there's no one you need to keep apprised of that process.
Okay, great.
Does that answer that question?
I think so.
Okay.
If not, they'll chat me. Oh, yep.
Okay.
Yes, indeed, it did answer the question. Great.
Okay.
Okay. So next question: if someone marks the content as free for commercial use, are they allowed to change it later? And if so, are we required to monitor the resources we use to check the Creative Commons status?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if the question asker is wanting to use it for commercial purposes or if that's just sort of...
I think if I'm understanding this correctly, that they're saying that they've found something that's marked free for commercial use and they start using it. Is the person who's marked it free for commercial use, can they go back later and change that? And could then we get in trouble for that?
So yes, they could go back and change it, but if you have accessed that resource and put it into your teaching materials during the time when it was available under an open license, then you don't have to go back and continually recheck that. So it's available under that license and you're using it under that license. You know, you don't. There's no obligation to go, you know, constantly monitor the changing license status of that resource, if that makes sense. So you can just incorporate it into your materials and keep using it. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it did. It did. Okay. Yep. And okay, that is all the questions that I'm seeing in the chat window. Do we have any other questions? Let me see if anyone has their hand raised. Nope. Okay. Well, if that's it, Kate, final words?
I was just going to say I forgot to switch it to this last slide that has my contact info, but that'll obviously be in the slides that go out. And a lot of these questions will continue to arise as you're putting your teaching materials together. And if as you're doing that you have any more copyright questions, or if anything occurs to you based on this presentation later, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. That's what I'm here for, and I'm happy to help you think through these issues.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate. We appreciate you joining us today. Thank you to everyone who attended this webinar, and have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.